Everyone, and welcome to this podcast. We've been focusing on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison, talking about religionless Christianity and how his view of Christianity post World War II would change, and how he thought Christianity would change, and believed that faith would become religionless. And so he sets faith and religion against each other. So today what I want to do is just take a little break from Bonhoeffer, not totally. So what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is going to frame my experience this past weekend going to a Metallica concert in the context of Bonhoeffer's religionless faith. Now, I'm going to do this by using a different book. This is actually a book that I wrote. It's been about 10 years, close to 10 years since I wrote this book. And it's an academic book that came out through Lexington Press. It's called Christianity and Heavy Metal is Impure Sacred Within the Secular West, Transgressing the Sacred. And my argument in the book is that heavy metal music, and you could use any genre of music or pop culture. You could talk about film, you can talk about a lot of different things, but I specifically focused on metal and heavy metal. And the argument that I'm making is that as many people abandon religion, as they turn away from institutionalized forms of religion, they're not actually abandoning faith. They're changing their faith. They're transforming faith, and they're focusing on something else. And all of this is grounded in kind of secularization theory, which I talk about in the book, but also then thinking about the experiences at a concert. And so this weekend, I went to see Metallica in Minneapolis. There was a couple of bands opening. Wasn't familiar with the very first band, but Five Finger Death Punch was the second band, and then Metallica was the headliner. And so I actually got there in time to see Five Finger Death Punch and Metallica. I waited in line to get a T-shirt, so I missed a little bit of Five Finger Death Punch. But even Five Finger Death Punch, which I'm not necessarily a fan, I thought they put on a great show. Their music fit this as well. And so what I want to do is kind of set the stage by talking about my book, the introduction in my book, and then using Metallica primarily, but we can talk about Five Finger Death Punch as well, as a way of demonstrating this religionless faith idea. And here's what struck me. So I'll tell you what's fascinating. And I know this is in Metallica's music, so for me that was no surprise. But what really surprised me was what I found in Five Finger Death Punch, the Five Finger Death Punch music. Because again, as somebody who is a theology professor, a pastor, and have immersed within the Christian world, I'm very familiar with the language and the rituals of the church. And what I experienced in the Five Finger Death Punch concert was a recognition of some of the spiritual language, I'll call it, that comes from the church. One of the songs of Five Finger Death Punch, I should have this up, but I don't, and it was fascinating to me, was something about "Wash It All Away." And of course, you can't not think of baptism as a central figure, a symbol in Christianity. And here is this heavy metal band singing about washing it all away. And what really struck me was the conversation that was had between songs. How gracious the lead singer was, how grateful the lead singer was, how he worked to instill a community through ritual, through a back and forth, a call and response, and which is basically liturgy. If you've ever gone to a Roman Catholic church or a high liturgical church, there's a call and response. The Lord be with you and with your spirit, and back and forth you go. And you find that at a metal show. And again, you also find it's interesting. I could go on and on about this, and I do in this book. But we talk about the garb that priests wear. Well, then you think about the metal people going on stage and what they're wearing. It's intentional. There's a garb. There's a costume involved, and so making those comparisons, I think, is fascinating. And what I'm not trying to do, and this is important, I'm not trying to colonize metal music with Christianity. What I'm trying to show is how a subculture like heavy metal is a new expression of faith apart from the institutional church that has maintained some of the language of Christianity and spirituality. And Metallica played Unforgiven. And at the end, James Hetfield just says, he puts out this plea that please forgive yourself. So this idea of forgiveness is a central theme in some of their music. Now, at the same time, their music is anti-institutional religion. And you can list off songs like, The God That Failed, Leper Messiah, all these different songs that take aim at institutionalized forms of religion. But yet the music maintains this sense of spirituality. And this is what I want to use as an example of what religionless faith is kind of tapping into. So the introduction of my book, it's actually called Finding God in the Dark, Heavy Metal as Impure Sacred. So one of the things that I'm doing is using Durkheim and, who's the other? Durkheim and Weber, thinking about religion sociologically. And so the reference to the pure and the impure sacred, the pure sacred is the way in the cultural forms, the symbols, the language, and what pure sacred does is it draws boundaries, and it says creates kind of an in and out group. So when you talk about taboos, when you talk about blasphemy and those types of things, you're creating kind of the in and out. You're forming a community and creating the boundaries within a community. That's the function of institutionalized religion. But the impure sacred then are those moments or these events. And I use the word event because I talk about John Caputo and Zizek and Badu and so on, and they refer to the event, that which cannot be described or contained within our language or our categories and all of these things. And those things rupture the boundaries. They break open the boundaries that we create, which is why it's referred to as the impure sacred. And so I start off by talking about, well, let me say this. The whole point of this book is to argue that heavy metal functions as a form of impure sacred and how it shares in common with Christian faith the cross as a form of impure sacred. Now, interestingly, what culturally we're always trying to do is kind of sanitize and tame these things and bring them into our symbolic understanding of reality. And so, and this in the metal world, they would say, oh, they've sold out or they've gone commercial or they've made it palatable in certain ways. And of course, Metallica is accused of that with the Black Album and everything else. But my point here is that metal functions in a similar way as the crucifixion and resurrection. Now, again, in religion, we do the same thing. We try to sanitize the cross. We sanitize the gospel. N.T. Wright has made a point of this in his book, The Day the Revolution Began. And so when they talk about the event of resurrection or crucifixion, what they're getting at is this thing that wants to rupture, the idea that God would die on a cross, that didn't make sense. And Paul says as much in Corinthians, like to the Jewish people and to the Greeks, the cross makes no sense. It is a stumbling block and it is foolishness. And so it's holding on to that understanding of the death and resurrection of Christ in that event form. is what the book is arguing. And so I'm trying to make a connection, not by colonizing heavy metal with Christianity, but by recognizing their touch points and the ways in which the language of Christian faith is represented in and maintains itself within the metal circles. So one of the things I start out with is this movie called Metalhead. It's great. Ragnar Brageson's film Metalhead. He's an Icelandic director. I actually got his permission. I had an email exchange with him to use this in the book. I frame this whole thing in that context of that story of this girl who loves her brother, looks up to her brother. Her brother's a metalhead, and then he dies in a tragic tractor accident. And so she kind of takes on this persona of the metal of her brother as a way of grieving. And it's a wonderful book because it shows her at odds with kind of the institutionalized forms of religion within Icelandic culture. And the film focuses on the idea of church burnings that were happening in the Scandinavian countries. So people involved in what's called black metal were burning some of these historic old, churches, in a sense, opposing Christianity or official forms of Christianity as, again, colonizing and wanting to get back to kind of, ancient pagan religion and so on and so forth. And so this is a big part of what the movie is about. But in the story, a priest comes to visit her, a pastor comes to visit her. And I just want to read what I wrote in here, and it has a quote. So the girl's name is Hera. It says, Hera has a conversation with the new local priest. She says the church has always belittled these bands. So she's talking about black metal. You say that they all worship Satan and such, but if you listen to the lyrics, they're about reality. Death is real. War is real. It tells things like they really are without sugarcoating. The priest responds by showing her a tattoo on his arm, demonstrating that he too is a metal fan. Hera asks him which bands he listens to, and he lists off many of the same bands she loves. Then the priest says this, God can also be found in the dark. Jesus wasn't afraid of sitting with the outcast. He was an outsider himself. That's the reason they nailed him to the cross. And then Hera replies by saying, he owes me. And I love that exchange that kind of takes place in the film. And a big part of the film then is Hera going to church and again, church burning and things like that. And so I wanted to frame this conversation in that context, because what Hera is saying there is there are strains of metal that are getting at a reality that the pure form of religion or Christianity isn't addressing. And so I've said this before, that Christianity or the church, isn't addressing the lived experiences of young people. And here she's making that same claim. And so then I go on to talk about pure and impure sacred, and then Christ as event, which I've already kind of talked about. And in the introduction, one of the things that I talk about is the different interpretations of secularization. So in understanding religionless faith, and what does it mean when Bonhoeffer says the world come of age, and Bonhoeffer's relationship with secularity, it is really important, I think, to understand the different theories that people are making about secularization. And so I actually use a piece written by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, where they explore kind of these different versions. And so they look at Max Weber's rationalization theory. They look at Durkheim's emphasis on differentiation and cultural differentiation. So if you think about the way in which culture develops through modernity, for example, confession becomes counseling, and you get this differentiation of different human experiences that are no longer under the religious institutions, but have become their own thing. But then he also talks about, they also talk about Rodney Stark and the supply side. And so making the claim, what Stark is saying is in our day now, we have access to all these different religious experiences and different religions and so on and so forth. So he calls it a supply side. The reason that there's secularization has to do more with the fact that we have access to all of these different religious experiences, and so there's a diversity that takes place. He's actually making the claim that there's no golden age of, religion and religiosity and so on and so forth. And what Norris and Engelhardt actually, where they land, and I use this in my book as a way of making the claim that I think that they're right. Not that the others are all wrong. I think there's something in each of them that is correct. But what they argue is that in the ancient cultures, religion really focused on security and stability, and it gave a sense of security in a world that was very, very hostile. And that as in the Western world, as these different cultures became industrialized and as they became more secure as far as food and life expectancy and all these types of things, there's a decline in religion. Or religion becomes merely an affirmation of the status quo. It's a positive version of the sacred, as we talked about before. And I think in some sense, I really like their argument because what happens is instead of looking at these ancient forms of religious belief as a way to get security, now they're the fields within culture itself. So economics, politics. I always tell my students, people used to kill each other over religion, and now people are killing each other over politics. But now economics is really, I think, one of the places where we seek our security. And even in pockets that want to call themselves religious or Christian and so on, and even in the pockets that want to call themselves religious. So I live in Northwest Iowa, a very, very religious place that's very wealthy. They connect the two. And again, this is where Christianity becomes a positive sacred, or the pure sacred, where it becomes cultural. It becomes an affirmation of a cultural way of life. And so I really feel like that security idea is a big part of what's happening in secularity and the rise of secularity. And so again, to bring it back to Bonhoeffer, what Bonhoeffer is saying is, who is Jesus Christ for today? And as we think about cultural ideology and as we think about political ideology, I think for Bonhoeffer, it's a question of how does the gospel not get reduced to these things? And how then do we return to an impure form of sacred in which Jesus Christ breaks in and breaks down kind of the pure sacred, the forms of pure sacred that we create that end up creating these barriers of division. And what I'm arguing here is that heavy metal does the same thing. That the shock in some metal and the language and the music and the I don't want to use the word violence, but there's this power that kind of comes through. What it's doing is it's creating this rupture, and it draws people in who have been alienated from these other cultural forms or from institutional forms of Christianity. And so I just want to just read a couple paragraphs here from the end of the introduction. And, I want to continue this in another podcast and maybe get in a little more to talking about Metallica and Five Finger Death Punch and looking at examples of it. And again, I'm not trying to colonize metal by doing this, but I'm trying to show or draw the connections between metal and Christian faith and religionless faith as Bonhoeffer is talking about it. So I'll just read a couple paragraphs and maybe make a few more comments. So here, the title or the subtitle of this paragraph is "The Transgression, Heavy Metal is Impure Sacred." So I write this: interpreting secularization within the context of Durkheim and Weber demonstrates that what results is not the eradication of the sacred, but its transformation within secular society. Religious ideology, with an emphasis on divine transcendence, gives way to new forms of cultural ideology grounded in the political, the economic, and technological spheres. The result is a new form of immanent sacred that is confirmed and supported by using religious language and symbols to legitimize the status quo. So in the ancient world, religion itself was the thing. And now we've embedded new forms of ideology and are undergirding it with religious language. So it's a pure form of sacred that is found in the economic and political and so on. The deep connections that exist between Christianity and Western culture are important for understanding how heavy metal becomes a community of practice that challenges both the religious and cultural ideology. When heavy metal is interpreted in the context of Western secularization and disenchantment, it clearly functions as an impure form of the sacred, as it seeks to transgress the pure form of the sacred represented by the cultural and religious status quo. By focusing on death, the grotesque, the demonic, and sexuality, heavy metal challenges cultural and religious norms, seeking to rupture oppressive forms of ideology. Well, on the surface, this immoral and sacrilegious ethos might suggest that heavy metal culture is antithetical to religious and cultural life, with its emphasis on death and chaos. This is not necessarily the case. Instead, the argument will be made that in utilizing images and symbols associated with death and violence, heavy metal has the potential to affirm the irreducible mystery of life. So one more paragraph, and I'll just say a few things. Here we discover the deep connection between heavy metal and the Christ event. Both are expressions of the impure sacred in response to religious and cultural ideology. While Christianity does manifest itself as a form of the pure sacred that functions as a guarantee of the status quo, the Christ event represents an expression of a transgressive sacrifice and expenditure that is revealed through the death, the grotesque, and violence. That, again, when you think of the crucifixion of Christ and the death of Christ on the cross, it is a grotesque event. Zizek has written a book called The Monstrosity of Christ. It's monstrous. It's a monster. What do we do with it? And our tendency is to always try to tame it and bring it in within our understanding of culture. I go on. Thus, while many within the heavy metal subculture see the practice of heavy metal as opposed to Christianity as a religion, the very use of Christian imagery and symbols within the metal subculture demonstrates the powerful relationship between the Christ event and heavy metal as expressions of the impure sacred that affirm life through negation and rupture. So by calling it impure, it's not negative. What it's saying is it wants to explode open these boundaries to make space for life and to affirm life. And that's the fascinating thing about going to these concerts. I've been to many concerts. It is an affirmation of community. You can't meet a nicer bunch of people than at a metal concert. Now, I'll tell you, Metallica fans, we're all kind of in our 50s now. We're getting older. So, maybe some of the rough spots are gone. But there was a lot of different age groups there. There were mosh pits going on and down on the floor, and there was young people all over the place. And it's, again, this question of what is drawing them to this. Not trying to colonize heavy metal with Christianity, but recognizing that there's these concentric circles that are taking place between the Christ event, which is tamed within religion, again, using Bonhoeffer. But when we get back to that event itself, there's a rupture that takes place that makes space for human life, that makes space for difference. And this is what I think Bonhoeffer is after in Religionless faith. And it doesn't mean we don't go to church, and you go to church or don't go to church, but I go to church. I'm a pastor. Doesn't mean we don't have liturgy or pray or all these other things. But it is this recognition that what the gospel is really about is about undermining these ideologies, cultural, religious, whatever, and opening the space for human life. So, in an introduction to the metal stuff, again, this is just a little aside to try to give some examples of this religionless faith. I'll continue this in the next podcast. We'll talk more about my experience at the Metallica concert, maybe read a little more from my book.